Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled Register of Authorized Intermediaries and Digitalization of Tax at Source Applications. My name is Emma Pulkkinen, and I will be your host and one of your speakers today. All of the speakers today are part of the special project in relation to the legislative change concerning nominee registered shares. So we have 3 different speakers today, including myself. Before moving on to the main content of today's webinar, I will tell you a few practicalities to take into consideration. So if you have any questions during the webinar, there is a chat window next to the presentation where you can post any questions. Our chat operators will be answering your questions during the webinar, but please take into consideration that answering the questions can take some time, so please be patient. And also note that there may be questions that we won't be able to answer during the webinar, but we will be compiling a questions and answers document that we will make available to all of you after the webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to tell you a little bit about our agenda for today. So first up will be my colleague Mari Säteri, who will tell you about the rights, responsibilities, and tax liability of an authorized intermediary. The first part of the presentation will take up to a maximum of 30 minutes. After Mari, my colleague Ulrika Harjunpää will tell you more about the practicalities of registering into the Register of Authorized Intermediaries. This presentation will take anything from 10 to 15 minutes. And then finally, I'm going to be telling you about the digitalization of tax at source applications, which will mean the refund applications and tax at source card applications, as well as any updates to our existing paper forms. And we're going to end the day with just some more information, where you can find it, who to contact, etc. Now, before I invite my colleague Mari to tell you more about the rights and responsibilities of an AI, I just wanted to remind you kind of where we're going now in regards to the implementation of the legislative change. So there's a lot of detailed guidance coming up, as you can see from the picture here. The guidance draft version of the investor self-declaration guidance is actually still out for comments. If you haven't received that yet for commenting, you can also request that from us through our financial sector email address. And then in addition, of course, we're also going to be sending out draft guidance regarding the Register of Authorized Intermediaries. Mari will mention a little bit about that. In addition, in the upcoming months, we're also going to be publishing the technical guidance for trace schema, and actually that draft version has already been out for comments. However, even if the commenting has technically ended for these draft versions, or at least some of them, you can always request us to send you the draft version in case you would like to know a little bit more about what's to come. And if you do have questions coming in late or comments, we will try and take that into consideration while we kind of prepare the final guidance. But now, without further ado, I invite my colleague Mari Säteri to come and tell you more about the rights and responsibilities of an authorized intermediary.
Hello, my name is Mari Säteri and I work as a senior advisor at the Finnish Tax Administration, and I will tell you about rights, responsibilities and liabilities of an authorized intermediary. My presentation is based on the Tax Administration's detailed guidance on the authorized intermediaries' responsibilities and liabilities, and I will be pointing out some main issues of the guidance. This guidance describes the registration requirements for registration and responsibilities and liabilities which registration to the Register of Authorized Intermediaries brings. As Emma already told you, the hearing of the draft guidance Finnish version has already ended, and English version will be sent out for comments by end of the next week. We would appreciate any comments and questions because the guidance is written for you to help to understand our new legislation and implementation of the trace when you are considering whether to act as an authorized intermediary or not. So, here are some backgrounds of the legislative change. The Parliament of Finland adopted a legal amendment to implement the OECD's TRACE model. TRACE stands for Treaty, Relief and Compliance Enhancement. The amendment changes the procedure of dividends paid to non-resident taxpayers when the issuer is publicly listed and the shares have been registered in a nominee account. The new legal provisions will go into effect on 1st of January 2022. The OECD TRACE model, which has been co-developed by the OECD, the financial industry, and tax administrations, was created to standardize the procedures for providing treaty relief at source. OECD has published TRACE implementation package for the adoption of the authorized intermediary system, and also most recently the TRACE XML schema and user guide. In Finland, 3 basic elements of the TRACE will be implemented: authorized intermediary procedure, investor self-declaration procedure, as well as direct TRACE reporting to the Finnish tax administration. TRACE IP also includes evaluation system where an independent reviewer performs evaluation, but Finnish tax administration does not require this option. However, authorized intermediaries can decide to use the independent review fully voluntarily. The reviewer's report can be used as proof that authorized intermediary has followed the legal requirements and the tax administration's guidance. The authorized intermediary system is implemented in Finland with a register based on legislation. The reason for this is that the Finnish legal system requires the taxation to be based on the legislation. And this is why we are not adopting TRACE contracts to be signed between authorized intermediary and tax administration. Instead, we will impose a set of requirements on the authorized intermediaries that are registered. And Finnish legal provisions determine the authorized intermediary's role in Finland and the obligations they must fulfill. By registration, intermediary gets the status of authorized intermediary. Finnish direct translation is registered custodian, but in English we use authorized intermediary, AI. The register comes into force on the 1st of January 2022. TRACE IP leaves the tax liability to be decided nationally. In Finland, the issuer is still the withholding agent, but an authorized intermediary is responsible of possible underwithholdings. The authorized intermediary accepts to become liable for the taxes by registration. Registration is voluntary, but registered intermediaries do enjoy certain benefits in comparison to non-registered intermediaries. Benefits of registration include possibility to apply treaty benefits at source to clients entitled to such treaty benefits. Authorized intermediary always has the right to not take responsibility of the dividends. An AI can decide by beneficiary and by payment if the dividend provisions of the tax treaty apply and whether treaty benefits can be granted to its customer at source. Tax treaty benefits do not need to be granted if the AI considers, for example, that it has not received sufficient information on the applicability of the tax treaty. And if the treaty benefits are not granted at source, then the refund procedure will be smoother in the future, as the tax administration has better visibility into the chain. An AI may also take responsibility for the dividends paid to the customers of a contractual intermediary. An AI may also has also the possibility of correcting tax withholding during the dividend payment year. Benefits of registration include also direct reporting of beneficial owner information to the Finnish tax administration, without having to send client information through the custody chain to the other intermediaries. So, authorized intermediary can send pooled information through the chain. Also, AIs can do business directly with Finnish tax administration and ask for other guidance. And by following the guidance, authorized intermediary will get legal certainty. So let's go into the responsibilities. Tax treaty benefits can be granted to a customer of an authorized intermediary if the authorized intermediary investigates and identifies the dividend beneficiary, reliably determines the beneficiary's country of residence for tax purposes, and verifies that the dividend regulations of the international treaty can be applied to the dividend beneficiary. A tax at source card or certificate of residence may be used to demonstrate and confirm country of residence. These documents are not mandatory to have if authorized intermediary follows the ISD procedure. So the ISD is the procedure how the beneficiaries have to be identified and documented that the authorized intermediary may grant treaty benefits to its customers. Procedure is based on trace model, and tax administration will implement it as a voluntary procedure for authorized intermediaries. And ISD is expected to be provided by the investor with all the necessary information and certified that it is the beneficial owner in accordance with the applicable tax treaty. The reliability of the declaration must be verified. The authorized intermediary must compare the ISD with supporting documents, and the content should not be contradictory to the authorized intermediary's other knowledge and information available about dividend beneficiary. And AI must use reasonable measures to ensure that the information contained in the ISD is correct for granting tax treaty benefits. And tax administration will release further instructions of the ISD and what procedures must be followed when verifying the reliability of the declaration. And by following this guidance, authorized intermediaries will get legal certainty. ISD procedure is voluntary, and the AI can still identify the customer also based on tax at source card or certificate of residence. The ISD doesn't have to be provided as a physical document. The Finnish tax administration accepts also electronic documentation. So then, reporting responsibilities. The OECD has released an international trace schema containing instructions for authorized intermediaries on how to submit annual information returns as an XML schema. Finland will implement a schema that requires the authorized intermediary to send the required details on dividend beneficiaries to the tax administration. The reporting requirement applies to the dividend beneficiary information for which the authorized intermediary has taken responsibility, and to the transmitting information at the time of the dividend payment. The granting of tax treaty benefits requires that the authorized intermediary reports the dividend beneficiary information to the tax administration. The AI who is closest to the investor reports the amount of tax at source to be withheld ahead in the chain and submits the dividend beneficiary information to the tax administration on an annual information return. That AI is also responsible for the correctness of that information. An AI must, at the request of the Finnish tax administration, provide further information regarding the dividends paid through the authorized intermediary. Also, an authorized intermediary must provide information for the purposes of auditing. Based on the legislation, the issuer has a right to receive the necessary information that they need in order to meet their tax obligations as withholding agent. For this reason, the authorized intermediary must provide, upon request, the issuer the necessary information. The legislation or tax administration does not define at which stage or in what manner the information must be delivered to the issuer. Section 10C of the Act on the Taxation of Non-Residents' Income regulates the authorized intermediary's tax liability. An authorized intermediary has a liability for underwithholding of tax. Authorized intermediary has tax liability for beneficial owners, which it has reported will lower tax rates in its annual information return to the tax administration, or has otherwise taken responsibility by notifying the issuer or another AI. Therefore, in practice, the authorized intermediary's tax liability is related to situations where the tax rate is under 30% based on tax treaty or tax has not been withheld. An AI does not have tax liability if the tax rate is 35%, and also in situation where the tax rate is 30% and authorized intermediary reports the information of the beneficiary to the tax administration, the authorized intermediary does not have tax liability. And authorized intermediary closest to the investor has the tax liability. If an authorized intermediary has withheld and reported too low tax rates, authorized intermediary is liable as if this uncollected tax had been imposed on the authorized intermediary itself. Authorized intermediaries are generally accountable for any tax that must be collected even after their registration is no longer valid. And an authorized intermediary is liable for any underwithholdings if the authorized intermediary has given or transmitted the incorrect annual information returns of the dividends. So the tax liability of an authorized intermediary concerns situations in which it has submitted the beneficial owner information on the annual information return. An authorized intermediary may choose whether it takes tax liability of the tax at source for the dividends at the time of dividend payment or later during the payment year, by notifying the payer or another AI of taking tax liability for the dividends. The AI has also tax liability if the issuer or another AI proves that AI has taken responsibility. This might be the case if the annual information return of the AIs are conflict with each other and AI has reported incorrectly. So, in order to release from tax liability, the AI must prove that the liability has been transferred to another AI. The AI is not responsible for any uncollected tax if it can show proof that it has forwarded the dividend payment information to the next AI or the issuer, as it has received the information from another AI. AI has to also ensure that the intermediary is registered in the Register of Authorized Intermediaries, and the register will be available in our website. An AI may be released from liability also by proving that it has fulfilled its responsibilities to take reasonable measures and did not know or should not have known that the dividend beneficiary provided incorrect or incomplete information. In order to be released from liability, the AI must prove that the tax wasn't withheld with too low rate due to the AI's neglect. An AI may also have to prove to the tax administration that the liability was transferred to another AI if the annual information return of the AIs are in conflict with each other. The AI may then prove by presenting a commitment made by another AI at the time of payment or later that it has taken responsibility for the dividends and taxes at source and is thus released from liability. So then some main principles of correcting AI's errors. If the authorized intermediary notices an error in the information it has forwarded or submitted in the annual information return, it must correct the error on its own initiative as soon as possible. The means for correction is determined depending on whether the correction has been noticed during the payment year or after the payment year. If the error is noticed during the payment year, the AI cannot correct the error directly to the tax administration because the issuer is responsible for withholding tax at source and paying it to the tax administration. Errors must be corrected during the payment year through the issuer. So it's so-called quick refund procedure, and the dividend beneficiary cannot apply for refund during the payment year. For example, if the AI receives an explanation that the beneficiary has right for tax treaty benefits and tax may be withheld lower rate than was originally applied, tax withholding can be corrected during the payment year through the issuer. If the error is noticed after the payment year, the AI must correct the error directly to the tax administration. Over withholding cannot be corrected after the payment year. Instead, the beneficiary can apply for refund from tax administration, or the AI may apply on behalf of the beneficiary. And more information about correcting will be in the guidance, and you can always send questions to us. Then few words about dividend beneficiaries' tax liability. Beneficiary has to provide a valid ISD and inform if there are any change of circumstances. Then the tax liability is thus transferred from the AI to the dividend beneficiary if the AI proves that it has taken reasonable measures and the error is caused by the dividend beneficiary alone. In a situation where the AI or beneficiary itself notices that the beneficiary has given incorrect information to the AI may correct the error on behalf of the beneficial owner. If the AI is unable to correct the error, the AI must notify the tax administration and beneficiary of error as soon as possible. In situations where the AI notices that the dividend beneficiary intentionally gave false information or otherwise acted fraudulently, the AI must notify tax administration as soon as possible and take other appropriate measures. So here are all the issues I wanted to point out of the AI's detailed guidance, and more information will be found in the guidance. And now my colleague Ulrika Harjonpää will now tell you more about registration and the Register of Authorized Intermediaries.
Hello, I'm Ulrika Harjonpää and I will tell you about registration of authorized intermediaries. First I go through some important dates, then registration process, and at the end we look at application forms. So, registration begins on 1st of July, but it comes into force on 1st of January 2021. So registration begins half a year beforehand. This register will be published at our webpage on 1st of January 2021. The current custodian register ends at the end of this year. So the current register ends when the new one comes into force. Even if the intermediary already is in the custodian register, they still need to apply for registration in the new register. Here are requirements that all the applicants must meet. The intermediary applying for registration has to have a permit for custodian activity, should be resident in the European Union or in the country that has signed a tax treaty with Finland, should be obligated to follow exchange of information rules or anti-money laundering and know your customer rules. Does not have taxational neglects. Taxational neglects means that the intermediary has not given all the tax returns required by Finnish tax administration, they have tax debts, or they have other significant non-compliances. If the intermediary has taxational neglects, they cannot be entered in the register since the registration requirements are not met. Applying for registration happens with application forms. There is two forms, one for registration and one for changes and termination. The application can be sent by post or by secured email. Application forms and filing instructions will be published on 1st of July. There are a couple of ways to find the form, and here is two of them. There are some documents that should be attached to the application. Those are a copy of permit for custodian activity, a copy of trade register extract or similar certificate of registration. Registration documents should contain information about applicant's name, domicile, line of business, accounting period, and the names of the persons entitled to sign for the company. This information is needed for creating a customer relationship in Finnish tax administration. There are some specialities related to head office and branches. They are not separate legal entities, and that's why they are tied together. Head office and branches can separately register for authorized intermediaries, and they are given their own Finnish business IDs. However, you should notice that their taxational neglects affects to each other. So, for example, if the branch has taxational neglects, the branch or the head office cannot be entered in the register. Then a couple of words about the registration process. Authorized intermediaries are given Finnish business ID when entered in the register. Registration begins and ends at the earliest on the date of decision. applicant can ask for later date but not earlier. So for example, if the applicant says that the begin date is 1st of January and the application is processed on 1st of February, the begin date is 1st of February. However, within this half-year period from July to December, the begin date will be 1st of January 2021, since that's the day when the register comes into force. A decision letter is sent to the applicant when the application is processed. Registration is valid until further notice. Normal processing time depends on the situation and the quality of the application. So how many applications there are in line and if all the necessary information is attached to the application. It's quicker if there are no missing information. So remember to check the application before submitting it. Deregistration. Registration status is checked regularly. An intermediary is removed from the register if they ask for it. Registration requirements are no longer met or intermediary has taxational neglects. So for example, if the intermediary has not given annual return related to dividends, it might be removed from the register. Then we can look at application forms. This might be a little bit small, but I will tell you what information there is. Some of you might have already seen drafts of the forms, but these are a bit different since we made some changes. Okay, then to the forms. This first one is for registration. First, there is basic information about applicant. So name, domicile, IDs and contact information. Then there is two fields for addresses. First one is for public address and the second one is for tax correspondence. You should only fill in address fields if you are not yet tax administration's customer. If you are, we already have your address and we are going to use that one. The last field in this page is start date of registration. As I mentioned before, it cannot be earlier than the date of decision, but it can be later. At the next page, there is information about head office. The branch is not separate legal entity, and that's why we also gather information about head office. At the end, there is information about attachments and date and signature. This is change and termination form. It's otherwise similar, but there is no address fields, and instead of start date, there is end date, and then there is an additional field for additional information. Address changes are in form with Y forms, and that's why there is no address field. This is paper form, so there is no electronic form. However, you can send the application by using secured email. That was all about registration. Next, Emma will tell you about digitalization of tax at source applications.
Thank you, Ulrika. So now I'm going to tell you a bit more about the digitalization of tax at source applications, i.e. our refund applications and tax at source card applications, as well as what this means for updating our existing paper forms. So before going into the forms and the digitalization, I wanted to give you a bit of background. Many of you may already be aware of the background. But as my colleague Mari was talking earlier, the beneficiary or their agent can request a tax at source card from the Finnish tax administration, for example, to show their residency status or to show they are entitled to a national exemption, such as the beneficiary being comparable to a tax-exempt Finnish entity. In addition, if too much tax was withheld during the year of payment, the beneficiary or their agent can then request a refund of tax at source after the year of payment. So this means that while I'm sure we all hope that as many beneficiaries can receive the correct withholding rate already at source, there's always going to be cases that go into the refund procedure. And in addition, as we're learning this new trace system and implementing it, we expect that the number of applications will at least temporarily increase due to the kind of learning process of what we can do at source and what should go into the refund procedure. So therefore, even though we don't have a legislative mandate to improve our refund and tax at source card procedure, of course, it's in all our interest to do so. So our goal is to smoothen the application procedure as well as prepare for this potential increase. And our goal is to provide non-residents the possibility to apply for a refund and tax at source cards electronically. And now, what has already changed? So if you've joined any of our online meetings, you've already heard a bit about our XML format bulk submission applications. And actually, starting from the 4th of May this year, refund applications can be submitted in XML format on our ilmoitin.fi portal. And actually then also from mid-June, you can submit tax at source card applications in bulk using the XML file. That will be available for testing around the 25th of May this year. In addition, attachments to these XML files are also given on the Ilmoitin portal. But I would want to remind you that the attachment can only be given once you've actually submitted an XML file. This is due to the fact that the attachment itself has to be matched to an existing application. But you would get an error while attaching something that doesn't match anything in our system. And just to make sure that our paper forms are up to date, we have updated those to match the content of the XML application. And the impacted forms are listed there on the slide, and these are essentially our refund applications and tax at source card application. And these have actually been published this week on the 11th of May, and they're available online as well as the instructions for filling out the forms. I would want to note that even though we're moving to the submission process becoming electronic, information requests and decisions are still going to be sent in paper form. Now, a little bit more about our XML bulk submission. So essentially the idea is that you can use one file to submit an application for several beneficiaries, and these beneficiaries can either be individual clients or corporate investors. And again, we're going to have separate XML files for refund applications and tax at source card applications because the content is, of course, a little bit different. And I would also like to point out that the tax at source card applications are only for our corporate clients. At the moment, we won't be offering the bulk submission for any individual clients requesting a tax at source card. Now, our XML schema is essentially split into two main structures. The message spec structure, which includes details on the entity that's actually submitting the file. This could be, for example, a software developing company. But then the main structure of the application is the WHT body structure, which includes the details on all the applicants. So there can be anything from one applicant to hundreds of applicants in that one structure. And it's also going to include information on the agent to whom any information requests and decisions should be sent to. So just to point out that essentially the entity that's actually submitting the file on Ilmoitin can be different to the one that's then stated as the agent in the XML file under the sender element. But how are you actually going to be submitting these? So I've talked a bit about now the Ilmoitin portal, but actually to submit, you also need to identify yourself when submitting. So for this year, you can still use the Katso ID to identify yourself in the Ilmoitin service. And then in addition to that, you're going to need a separate role, the name of which I've stated there, applying for a refund of tax at source and tax at source card. And with that role, you can then submit both types of XML applications. And here's where you kind of need to take into consideration that you don't need to get a Katso ID for each applicant separately. So it's actually enough that the software company or the agent, whoever is actually submitting the XML file on Ilmoitin, that is the entity that is identifying itself. So that's a bit easier than you having to go through the process of getting IDs for all the separate applicants. However, I would like to point out that because this is a bit easier, then you will need to give as an attachment a power of attorney to still show that the agent is able to represent the client. And then a little bit about the attachments. So attachments are sent separately from the actual XML file, but that is also done on the Ilmoitin portal. And attachments should be submitted within 1 week of submitting the XML file. This is because if you submit them later, we could request for missing attachments, as we are expecting you to essentially send the attachments as soon as you have submitted an application. And again, to point out, you can only submit attachments once you've actually submitted an XML file. The same attachments that are mandatory on paper also need to be submitted when sending applications on Ilmoitin. And essentially, depending on what you're doing, so if you are submitting electronically the actual application, you also need to submit the attachments electronically. Similarly, if you are still using the paper forms, you will also need to send any attachments in paper form. And as I stated earlier, why it's important that you take into consideration that you can only send attachments once an XML file has been submitted is because we actually match the attachment to the correct application using the application ID element that is in the XML file. So that's why actually naming the attachments is really important. So we're going to use that application ID in the name of the attachment to match to the existing application. But like I said earlier, Ilmoitin will actually tell you if you have named something incorrectly. And yeah, here I've just listed for your reference in the future. These are all available in our technical guidance as well. Some examples of how the attachments would be named. So the naming convention for refund applications would, for example, be WHT, then the applicant's TIN, the year of application, and any specifier of your choice. So that could be a number, a letter, whatever is good for your filing systems. And then finally, the type of enclosure. So essentially the name of the attachment, what type of attachment it is. And here, and then on the next slide, I've listed a few examples. So the first one being, for example, the power of attorney. And yeah, just make sure to follow the naming convention, as it is really important for us to not only match the attachment to the correct application, but also for us to identify what's actually in the attachment. And if I didn't mention already earlier, as you can see here, the attachments are always submitted in PDF form. And now I'm going to go through our updates to paper forms, as I'm sure many of you are still using those. And there's also, of course, going to be a period where it's going to take time for you to take these electronic submissions on board. So as a result of this XML format application, we've also made some changes to the paper forms. And our goal is, of course, that over time you're going to be using less and less paper applications, and that then only those applicants who really do not have any access to electronic submission channels would be still using paper. And like I said earlier, the updates to the forms have been published on 11th of May, along with the updated instructions for filling out the forms. Now, we already received a question regarding whether you're still able to use the old versions of the forms. And yes, you can still use the old QR coded forms, but you should, as soon as possible, adopt the newest form possible. There's always a reason why we've made changes to the forms. Essentially, it's usually because we're not getting the information necessary to make a decision, and then we have to send you an information request, and it kind of prolongs the procedure. So we kind of want to move to the possibility of having all the necessary information from the very beginning, so you can get your refund decision as soon as possible. So now I'm going to go through each of the forms that I mentioned earlier that there have been changes to. And first up here is changes to forms 6163E and 6167E. And this is the refund application for corporate clients. So the first change that has been made is a small change to the legal entity type choices. And actually, if it's easy for you, you can still go and Google the forms and have that there next to you so you can see which fields I'm referring to. But essentially for this field, 1.14, we've combined two different options, association and charity, into one option. So before, these were separate, and now there's essentially only one option, association or charity. And of course, because we've made that small change, it's also impacted the numbering of some of the other options. But again, as usual in that field, if you feel like none of the given options apply to you, just choose other and give us a bit more detail on what your legal entity type is. Then another addition we've made is the new field for umbrella funds. And here I just want to point out that if you are not part of an umbrella fund, i.e. a main fund or a sub-fund, you just skip this section. You do not need to fill it in. So this is only for those applicants, as we've noticed that we often need more information on the umbrella fund itself. So that's why we've now added it as an option on the application form. So essentially, if you are part of an umbrella fund, we want to know whether you are the main fund or the sub-fund. And depending what your response is to that first question, we then want you to give details on the other entity. So if the applicant is the main fund, we would want to see a list of sub-funds to which the dividends were paid to. And if the applicant is the sub-fund, we would want to know to which main fund that sub-fund belongs to. Then next up, the fields 1.9 to 1.21. So all the questions on previous applications and quick refunds. So here we're asking you to give information on any previous applications you've made more generally. That's basically for us to know whether you are already in our system or not. But also we want to know whether you've made an application specifically on this income before. There could, for example, be the case that you've made two separate applications where one is based on a tax convention and the other is based on EU law. And essentially here, if the applicant has requested a refund during the payment year, you would answer yes. And if you have several dividends or income payments on the same application, it's enough that at least one has been applied for, that you should then tick yes. Then, many of you know, we've actually had the permanent establishment question on our application form before. We've now brought it back. Essentially, before it was an issue of space on the application, but now as we want the content to match the electronic format, we've now reintroduced this question onto the application. But essentially, the application should only be used by corporate entities that do not have a permanent establishment in Finland. If the foreign corporate entity has a permanent establishment in Finland and the income is actually allocated to that permanent establishment, then you should report those dividends on your annual income tax return. Here I've listed the form 6U. But of course, there may be some exceptional circumstances where a tax at source card is possible to give to somebody that has a permanent establishment. So that's why we've added that question there. Then something that I'm hoping will ease our work and yours is that we've added the representatives identifier. So it's actually for you, if you wish to better track all applications sent by a certain representative, it's a good idea to give some sort of identifier, which would be the agent's TIN or a Finnish business ID or any other identifier, because with this identifier we can actually then get a report of all the applications sent using that same identifier. So, for example, if you're checking with us the status of reclaims, then that would be a good way to give us, oh, we want to check, or a list of all the applications we've sent under this identifier. And then lastly, for Form 6163E, we have information on the dividend income. And as you may remember, before we've asked basically whether you have a direct ownership, so direct shareholding, or whether you've received the dividends through a fund or a partnership. So we've now actually added a fourth option, which is that the dividend was received based on a nominee registered share. And this is actually the majority of cases. So the majority of our applicants have received the dividend income based on a nominee registered share. But again, if you're unsure, you can always tick the direct shareholding as well. But essentially, that is the case for the majority. Then we've added the payer's ISIN code. So that helps us actually identify the dividend paying company. And I've also understood that this is a good way for yourselves to also identify the dividend payments. So that's very important actually that you start using the ISIN code, because that helps us better identify the dividend paying company. And then we've split the beneficial owner question, which was a one tick in the box option before, and now we're actually splitting it into 4 separate questions instead of one. And essentially you're going to have to be giving us a yes/no answer. So here I don't want to go into too much detail because it is a bit more complicated, but these are in the online instructions, so they're separate instructions depending on the income type. And also, I just want to stress that if there's ever any uncertainty on how to answer those questions, you can always leave them blank. And then, like I said before, we've added the payer's ISIN, so this is also applicable to the 6167E form, which is essentially where you will be giving the details of the dividend income. So that is the only change that has been made to that form. Then, on behalf of my colleagues in the individual taxation unit, I just want to point out a few things that have happened with the 6164E form. So this is the refund applications for individual applicants. Essentially, the biggest change is that the layout of the form has changed, while the content has not changed quite as much as maybe the 6163E form. There are some new fields, one of which is, for example, this ISIN code of the payer that I was discussing before. And another one is the grounds for refund application. So similarly, for corporate entities, we've had the options of tax treaty, EU law, and other. So now for our individual applicants, we also have 2 options now, which is the tax convention or other reason. And similarly to our corporate form, there's new instructions for filling in the form, and we've tried to make these as readable as possible so that we go through each separate field. So make sure to always check those instructions first, and if there's of course anything unclear, then be in contact with us. And like with our corporate form, it's important to use the latest form 6164E. As you know, as I stated earlier, there's a reason why we make changes to the forms. So it's important that we get as much information as possible from the very beginning. And now the last form that I want to tell you about is the 6211E application form, which is the tax at source card application for corporate entities. Now, the first thing that we changed is we've added a new tick in the box option for the applicant legal entity type. So before we just had a free format field, and now we've made essentially the same tick in the box option as we have in the refund application form. And it's basically, just to give you a bit of a background why we have those options, is that we've actually fitted those to fit the trace schema, so that in the future we can then better match those applicants as well. Then we've added whether the applicant is stock exchange listed. Again, this is something that is already available in the refund form. So now we've just added it onto the tax at source card form as well, as this can impact the tax at source percentage that's given. For example, there is legislation that states that, for example, a publicly listed company receiving dividends from a Finnish publicly listed company could be found tax exempt. So that's why it's an important section to fill in if you truly are stock exchange listed. And in addition, we would ask that then you would give us the ISIN code of the security so we can check that you are indeed publicly listed. Then, similar to the refund form again, we've added a new field for umbrella funds. And again, here, basically what we want to know is whether the applicant is the main or sub-fund. And again, similarly, we've added the permanent establishment question. And like before, the application should only really be used by corporate entities that do not have a permanent establishment in Finland. Then a similar addition again, the representative's identifier. Once again, this is would be an easy way for you to check with us, like, oh, we've sent you a batch of applications with X dates, and we've used this identifier on the applications. So it's better for us to then be able to track those applications and give more information to you. Again, that identifier can really be anything. So it could be the representative's tax identification number. It could be a Finnish business ID. It could be any other registration code given in their country of residence. And then previous tax at source cards and refund decisions. Essentially, we kind of want to know if you have any previous decisions. Again, it's for us to mainly check that whether you're already in our system, but also then we can see if there's been any changes in circumstances, then it's possible that we don't really need to ask for further information. Though I would like to point out one exception here, which is the applications where an investment fund is asking for comparability to a Finnish tax-exempt investment fund, as the legislation has now changed. So essentially we're this year reevaluating all of those. So you will need to provide more detailed explanation. But nevertheless, if you know that you already have a previous tax at source card or a previous refund decision, make sure to tick yes and give the decision number. Then something that hasn't really been on our form before, so that is the several payers option. And this option is essentially meant for those applicants that wish to get a tax at source card that is applicable to all dividends paid by Finnish publicly listed companies. So for those situations, if you would want this kind of tax at source card, you would tick yes, and then we will issue a card that is applicable for all those payers. But again, if you want the tax at source card to be for one payer specifically, then you would tick no and give us more detailed information on the dividend payer or the other income payer. As you know, this is also for interest and royalty income. And then, like the refund application, we've again split the share lending and beneficial owner question from 1 to 4 separate yes and no questions. But here it's a bit different. I really want to stress that you should only answer these questions if the income has already been paid. But otherwise, just make sure to check the online instructions. Again, how you're supposed to respond here depends on what sort of income you're receiving. And finally, in relation to this digitalization of tax at source applications, I wanted to mention MyTax, as we are in the process of developing a MyTax application. The preliminary launch date is in late autumn this year, and we still have a few kinks to work out. As you can see from the slide here, some sort of identification into MyTax is necessary, but we're kind of working out on what's a kind of easy way for you to identify into the system so you can submit an application on MyTax. And again, here it's going to be so that either the income earner or like the income receiver themselves can submit an application, or again, an agent representing them can do so as well. And on MyTax, it's not going to be the same as the bulk submission. So here it's actually that you will fill in one application per applicant. And for refunds, that can be one individual applicant or one corporate applicant. And then for tax at source cards, that will be only for corporate applicants. So yeah, stay tuned for that. We're going to be posting more information as we move on in the year. And just here, finally, I wanted to kind of give you in the material the links to the most relevant web pages. So where you can find the XML schema, XML example files, the actual ilmoitin.fi portal, as well as where you can find the updated paper forms, as well as the instructions for filling the paper forms. And now, before we end the webinar, I just want to give you a few links and our contact information. So if you want to keep up to date more generally about the legislative change regarding nominee registered shares, make sure to follow our financial sector and taxation webpage. All the current issues are always posted on the front page. For example, today's webinar is on the front page now, as it is the most topical thing coming up. I also recommend that you subscribe to our financial sector newsletter if you have not already done so, because from there you will also get first-hand information on any upcoming webinars, meetings, guidance, any sort of information, not just concerning the legislative change, but anything in this field of withholding tax and the financial sector more generally. The financial sector page actually also has its own subpage for the legislative change, so make sure to keep an eye on that as well. And we are going to be updating that page as the implementation of the legislative change progresses. Okay, so now we've actually reached the end of the webinar today. Thank you to all our viewers for joining today. And just as a reminder, if you have any further questions, you can always send those to our group email, financialsector@vero.fi, which I have posted there on the slide for you as well. And furthermore, a recording of the webinar will be available on YouTube by tomorrow. Technically, it should be available there as soon as this webinar ends. So if you were unable to join today, or if there's something you still kind of want to go through again, just go on YouTube to check the recording. As well, the presentation material is already available on tax.fi, and you can also find always more information there on any upcoming webinars. So we're going to start ending for today. Our chat operators are still going to stay with you for a few moments to answer some questions, but there may be, again, as I stated, a lot of questions or some questions that we simply cannot answer right now, but we will be compiling a questions and answers document afterwards and make it available to all of you on tax.fi. So that's all from me. Thank you everyone for joining today, and have a great day.